friends. I'm excited to get into the Word with you today. We're going to visit the Old Testament way back to some of the first books. I'm going to have to condense several chapters into just a few sentences to set things up for you, but I hope it encourages you to want to go back and read, because through a very interesting series of events, Pharaoh had set Joseph, who was Jacob's son, or Israel's son, over all of Egypt. And as a result, Joseph was able then to bring his family into Egypt during a famine to make sure that they were well taken care of. But over time, about 400 years, the population of the people of Israel grew so big in numbers that the new king over Egypt, who hadn't known Joseph, feared the Israelites might overtake them. So he made them slaves. And in Exodus chapter 2, we read that the king died. But we also read, quote, that the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and they cried out for help. Of course, God sent Moses to lead them out of Egypt and slavery. I encourage you to go back and read about it. It's a fascinating story. But many times when I read about the Israelites' exodus out of Egypt and their journey in the wilderness, I would get so irritated with them. They complained a lot. Before they were even fully delivered out of Egypt, they were already thinking about going back to be slaves. See, this new Pharaoh had decided that he couldn't let them stop serving him, so he gathered his army and he went after them. Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 12 says this: When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. But it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." The Israelites had already seen God send plagues to the Egyptians, all the while protecting them, his people, from that harm and misery. And they had already so quickly forgotten. But in verse 13, and Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today." So, of course, God did save Israel in a glorious show, by the way. The faith of his people was renewed. And in the next chapter, we see that they had a big celebration. But after that, they again quickly forgot of God's faithfulness. Time after time, over the next 40 years, you see them wishing to be back in Egypt. Exodus chapter 16:3 says, "And the people of Israel said to them, 'Would that we have died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger.'" Numbers 14:4. "And they said to one another, 'Let's choose a leader and go back to Egypt.'" Then in Numbers chapter 20, verse 5, "And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place?" Numbers chapter 21, verse 5. "And the people spoke against God and against Moses. 'Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there's no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food.'" They were hangry. During all this, though, here are a few things that the Israelites had witnessed already. Pillars of cloud and fire to lead them. Bitter waters were made sweet and drinkable. Manna rains from heaven for bread to eat. The wind brings along quail to provide meat for them. Water comes from a rock. God speaks from the mountain at Sinai. And there were so many more. God performed miracles abounding, and yet time and again the Israelites would forget. I just get so frustrated. And then one day I realized that the Israelites actually have quite a bit in common with me. And maybe you as well. See, they were afraid of the unknown. They were thinking, I don't know how this will turn out. Am I going to survive this? Things were tough. I'm sure they thought this hurts too much. It's too difficult. At least with the old life, I knew how. I was surviving. I'd learned to be comfortable with it. Does this sound familiar? Has God called you to change, to do something new, different, big? When we're afraid, when things get tough, we want familiar, easy. Obviously, the Israelites did not like slavery. They groaned because of their slavery. Remember, they cried out to God for help, but it was something they knew. So when things got tough and scary, they figured the best plan was just to go back to how things were. But God wanted better for them. So let's talk about you and me. How many times has God worked miracles in our lives? How many times has He provided for us? How many times has He protected us? How many times has He revealed Himself to us, changing our lives for the better? How I wish I had time to tell you how God has worked in my life over and over for better and for even better still. Though I still have quite a ways to go, I know. God lets us walk through tough times to give us something better. That's what He did with the Israelites. He brought them out of slavery and He led them to the promised land. They had to go through a lot of discomfort and experience a lot of growth before God allowed them to get there. Some of the suffering they brought on themselves, as do we. But God didn't let it happen in vain then, and He doesn't now with us either. He used all of it to teach them, to grow them, and to bring them closer to Him. And that's a great place to be. He does the same for us. So, first of all, when God calls us to action, we should act, trusting that He is going with us. When things get tough or scary, and they will, we must remember all of the times when He has been there and He's taken care of us. We just talked about this in our Bible study. We'd also gotten advice a few years ago to write things down. So when we started to have doubts, like the Israelites, we could remember how God has worked in our lives already toward His purpose for us. I encourage you to remember, write it down if it helps, how He has worked in your lives already. And when things look uncertain or frightening, your faith will be strengthened because of what you recall. And you'll be able to carry on. James chapter 1 verses 2 and 3 says, Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. It was such a pleasure to visit with you today. What are some verses that help you when you become afraid or begin to doubt, or you're getting tired and begin to wonder how much longer you can go on? Please share your verse. It may be a lifeline to someone else today. Thanks, guys, and God bless.